Welcome to Moviezilla. Today, we will be reviewing the film, Possessor, released in 2020. The movie begins with ominous music and a shot of the back of a woman's head. A large needle is then inserted into the top of her skull, causing blood to drip out on entry. She displays several emotions over the course of a few seconds. Happiness, then sadness, and then nothing. She then steps away from the machine. At a hotel check-in counter, a separate woman enters and observes her surroundings. She is called over by her friend and then enters an elevator, joining a group of girls all wearing blue tracksuits. The only source of light in the elevator is a dim blood-red bulb. As it ascends, we see a view of the city. We then follow the women up a flight of stairs drastically different from the elevator. Illuminated by white lights and gold walls, they enter a room full of sculptures and people talking. As they walk through the room, the women in tracksuits split off to socialize with the guests. One woman in particular walks toward a man in a suit, where she quietly unveils a knife, unbeknownst to the patrons in the room. With a quick and brutal jab, she cuts the man's throat to the horror of the guests. Unperturbed, she executes another jab to his throat to knock him down. She then follows with a flurry of jabs to his abdomen. The woman slides her hand along the fresh blood on the ground, admiring it like an exquisite painting. She then stands up and pulls a gun out of a bag. Speaking into the air, she orders, "Pull me out," and puts the gun in her mouth. With tears in her eyes and obvious reluctance, she removes the gun. Police approach her and unleash bullet fire onto her as she raises her gun once again. Although mildly confused, she is dead. Elsewhere, a blonde woman wakes in a hospital bed removing a helmet. Her body is reacting terribly to the death of her previous host. She is then given a series of tests to test her memory, where she is asked to identify various items. She identifies her grandfather's pipe and taxidermy of a butterfly. The last item she is unable to identify. With this, they conclude the results are normal with no evidence of psychotic break or false psyche. Though seemingly distant, the blonde woman speaks about taking time off with a man named Michael. She is then seen walking out of the building with a suitcase before entering a vehicle. The next morning, she is seen rehearsing a conversation with her family. Switching tones with each repetition, it is as if she is practicing how to display emotion. When she enters the house and sits with her family, they talk about their work and other small talk. Her husband is a writer, and they watch a news report describing the homicide secretly committed by the woman. She doesn't seem to care. Later that night, they are having dinner with their friends. Wanting to be alone, they ask their friends to leave before romantically engaging for the night. Despite the intimate moment, she does not seem to be enjoying it as she is too distracted by the details of the murder. Later, she calls her employer to let her know that she is ready for the next contract. Noticing that something is wrong, the husband confronts Taz, the blonde woman, but she is so distant she can barely respond. She is busy hallucinating that blood is gushing from his neck. Memories of the murder are merging with her real life. Later, Taz is back in her boss's office where they discuss the need to find a replacement for her position. She offers the position to Taz, which honors her, but the boss doubts Taz's mental state. She believes that Taz still hasn't left her old life behind. To prove this, the boss projects photos from the homicide and questions why Taz stabbed the lawyer despite being given a gun. Pondering this, they begin discussing the next contract. Taz is ordered to possess a man named Colin Tate. Her mission is to use Colin as a way to control the company he works at. While the pay will be lucrative, it will be a difficult mission that requires careful planning. Taz begins stalking Colin and his wife to learn his mannerisms. Through a bug in his house, she is listening intently to their conversations. Copying and practicing how he speaks and sounds, she suddenly feels a sharp pain in her arm causing her to react. The next day, Colin is in a van attached to medical gear. He is clearly being prepared for possession, while Taz is being informed of Colin's wife and certain health symptoms. After Colin is prepared, Taz is attached to a table and is transferred into Colin's body. Through a peculiar transition of Taz's body, melting and morphing into Colin's, she wakes up in his body. Colin is now in bed with Ava, Colin's wife, and he gets up from the bed. Clearly unused to the new body, he looks around in an odd manner before looking out the window. He then goes to the bathroom to inspect himself before we see him walking into his room to look at his wife. Obviously expecting nothing wrong, she asks Colin about his work trip. Attempting to act normal, Ava seems to notice immediately that something is off. Stepping away, Colin then notices a small orb floating in the corner of his eye. After reaching for it, he realizes that it is gone. After getting ready for work, Colin walks into his office building. A long line of people in blue shirts and name tags are already there. After speaking briefly with a coworker, he steps into a room with people viewing something through odd-looking goggles. Putting on his own pair, he enters a virtual office with a camera connected to a room. He then inspects the curtains in the background, describing them out loud. With this monotonous work, he inspects several rooms before seeing a couple engaging in sex. Distracted, a woman scolds him to hurry up. While he tries to get back to work, he stops again after hallucinating an eyeball. Shocked, he rips off his goggles only to notice the same floating white orb. Reaching for it again, it disappears on contact. Suffering from mental strain, he starts hallucinating various images that begin to melt together. Unsure of what to make of it, he then looks in a mirror where he sees both Colin and Taz. They both stare at each other with frightened looks on their faces. Suddenly, Colin wakes up with a voice in his head. It's Gerda asking what happened to her. Taz reassures her that everything is under control, without mentioning the split in control she was feeling. After going to the bathroom, Colin walks to Taz's house and looks at her son and husband through the window. He then goes back to his own home. Ava, hanging with some friends, reveals she was worried about Colin after being missing the entire day. Acting uncomfortable, he notices a man in a photo on the table and asks who it is. This shocks her because the man in the picture is himself. He then goes to the bathroom to wash his face, where a friend of Ava steps into the room. She asks to be friends with him again, presumably his ex. Colin returns to his bedroom and is smoking in front of the window. Ava steps into the room and talks to him about how he is acting strange. After a bit of talking, they have sex. During this, we see various hallucinations which cause Colin to stop as eyes begin to appear on the walls. The next morning, Colin is sitting on the floor, trying to speak with Gerda to report on the situation. Noticing something is off, Gerda asks him to recalibrate. Complying, Colin inserts a needle into his head. Once again, Colin's face bends and morphs to display different emotions: happiness, anger, sadness, and nothing. Colin then goes to a party where a man gives a speech to his guests. After the speech, Colin and Ava approach him. He is Ava's father, Parse, who proceeds to make negative remarks about Colin. Colin then enters a room and reports to Gerda. He is given the next step of the mission, to have a public fight with Parse and get thrown out. After multiple drinks, Colin begins to stumble and slur his words. He goes to get another drink when he approaches Parse. He asks for an apology from Parse but is rejected. He makes another effort to aggravate Parse by making a lewd remark about Ava. A friend of Parse puts his hand on Colin. Colin immediately retaliates and, while being held back, again insults Ava. After making a scene, he is thrown out of the house just as planned. Repositioning himself, Colin pulls a gun out and gets ready to re-enter the home. He looks for Parse and Ava and finds them in the dining room talking and drinking. After some thought, he arms himself with a metal rod instead of his gun. Going to bed, Ava then leaves her father alone. Realizing it is the perfect time, Colin sits down with him and places his gun on the table. Parse doesn't flinch and tells him to get out before the police are called. After getting up and taking a few steps, he suddenly reaches for the gun. Prepared for this, Colin strikes him with the metal rod, knocking him to the ground, repeatedly beating him with it. Hearing a commotion, Ava walks into the room and screams. As she is running out, Colin shoots her but fails to kill her. He follows and finds Ava stumbling from the blood loss, crawling away in hopes of escape. With tears flowing down her face, Colin wipes them away. He then pulls his gun out and shoots her in the head. Colin then mutters, "Pull me out," before putting the gun into his mouth. Similar to the prior assassination, Colin hesitates to pull the trigger. He begins to beg to be taken out before flashing hallucinations begin. Taz and Colin are pulling each other apart. Colin then grabs a shard of glass and stabs the back of his head, ending the hallucinations. Elsewhere, Taz begins to cough up blood in the hospital bed. She is surging due to the damage in the brain implant. We see a blurry shot of Colin walking through a busy street, scared and covered in blood. He quickly grabs a bag from the trash. Meanwhile, Girder is looking for Colin while Taz lays in bed. It seems that Taz has lost control of Colin's body while he is trying to remove the implant from his brain. Haunted by visions of the previous night, he receives a call from Girder. He then steps out and realizes he is being followed by a group of men. Unsure of where to go, he travels to the home of his ex-girlfriend. Telling her that he wants to be together, she is unaware of what happened the night before. Muttering about someone named Michael, she doesn't know who that is. It is clear that Taz's memories are seeping into his. Colin then asks to stay at his ex-girlfriend Rita's house, lying that he had a fight with Ava. Unaware of what is going on, she allows him to stay for 2 nights. Clearly suffering from PTSD, he pulls the gun from his pocket and walks to the bathroom where Rita is showering. He then aims his gun at her back. When Rita turns around, it is Taz in Colin's clothing. Later, a news report reveals that while Parse survived the attack, Ava is dead. His friend Eddie then knocks on the door to check up on him. When Colin's back is turned, Eddie pulls a makeshift gun out and shoots him in the back of the head. Eddie was sent by Girder to help Taz regain control of Colin's body. He reveals that he was also the collaborator that scouted Colin for the job. Eddie runs some test on Colin that consists of images of animals. He then tests Colin's pulse. By pressing a button, the room begins to switch between Colin and Taz. With each press, Colin can be seen approaching Taz in a blood-red room. They begin to fight for control of the main body. Overpowering her, Colin begins to choke Taz before he crushes her skull. He removes her face and puts it over his head like a mask. With the face of Taz, he begins to see her memories. Her first murder, her family, and more. This continues until he wakes up with a gun under his chin and Eddie is dead on the floor. Frantically washing his hands, it seems that Colin has regained control. It is only then that he sees Rita dead on the floor. Overcome by the shock, he grabs his gun and points it at his head. Struggling, he realizes he doesn't have the courage to shoot himself. Then, Taz's real body begins to mutter to Colin. Unsure of what to do, Colin goes to Taz's home, rehearsing what he is going to say to her family. Noticing Taz's son, Colin goes over to him and begins to speak with him. Michael, Taz's husband, then calls him back home. Standing outside, he watches until nightfall. Colin then rings the doorbell and continues knocking until Michael opens the door. Colin then introduces himself as a friend of Taz. He then quickly pulls his gun out and enters the home, where he questions Michael about Taz's whereabouts. He wants to know what Taz did to him. Colin begins to rant about a parasite in his brain, to the confusion of everyone. He uses Taz as an example of what the parasite is doing to him. Realizing they have no idea what he is talking about, Colin threatens Taz with her husband. He begins to hallucinate and see Taz speaking with him. She tells him that she hasn't done anything and that he has been in control this entire time. She looks at Michael with pity and wonders if she really loved him. During this interaction, Michael swats the gun from Colin and attempts to shoot him. Colin then grabs a cleaver and begins to stab him until he is dead. Colin then mutters, "Pull me out," and inserts the gun into his mouth. Though he is reluctant, he can't pull the trigger. Tears flowing down his eyes. While distracted, the young son then stabs him in the throat. Colin shoots him in retaliation, and in a fit of rage, we are unsure if it is Taz or Colin. Both falling to the floor, they die. Later, Taz reawakens on the hospital bed. Gerder is also in a bed next to her. Taz is retaking the same test as before, identifying her grandfather's pipe and the taxidermy of the butterfly. The movie ends with Taz admiring the red butterfly.